How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux, and I am solo this week. And I have been thinking about what I want to do when I have these solo episodes. And I got a lot of good feedback about some of the solo episodes I did, but in particular, this last one about Barabbas and doing these kind of niche dives into the scriptures. And so I thought I would do another one similar to that. And as many of you guys know, as I've announced on here, and some of you guys that follow on TikTok, I've been doing a series on there where I'm walking through the Bible in a year, and I'm a little bit behind on it, but I'm getting caught up. But I'm currently in the book of Judges. And so I thought I would try to find, when I do these solo episodes, try to find some stories that are lesser known to just dive into. So either some like cool topics that kind of correlate from Old Testament to New Testament, like I did with Barabbas and the scapegoat ritual last time. And so this time I found a story that's pretty interesting and kind of random, but I just thought it was cool. And I really think that if you just read it for on face value, it might seem like a very random story and why is this told? But I think it actually has a lot of applications for us today. And so we're gonna dive into it. I think it's one of the most like cinematic movie-like stories, and it's short. So if you'd like to go read the actual story, it's in Judges 3 verses 12 through 30. So it's about 18 verses there. So it's not super long, but I think it is very interesting and it's kind of shocking. It's one of those random stories in the Bible where you're like, wow, I wouldn't have expected to read this in the scriptures. It seems like a movie, like an action movie. It has espionage, it has a hidden weapon, it has a private meeting with the king, and it has a left-handed, which is important, a left-handed assassin chosen by God. And a lot of people who aren't super familiar with the Bible have never really heard this story, but it's packed with meaning for our lives today. And what we are talking about is the story of Ehud. Ehud, it's spelled Ehud. And like I said, it's in Judges chapter 3. And before you tune out and think like, man, I don't want to hear one of these weird old stories from the Old Testament, the story really speaks directly to those who are feeling overlooked, that God is using unexpectedly. It shows that God uses, as we've seen in a lot of the episodes that we've done before, that God uses unexpected people. It shows courage in an impossible situation and how God delivers his people time and time again. And because sometimes God's deliverance doesn't look religious, it looks disruptive. And I think that that is what this story does. It's very random, it's very strange, but God uses those type of moments to deliver his people. Okay, so the first part, I want to give you the context, and that is what's going on in Judges, the cycle that Israel continues to go through. And if you don't know, I think lots of times when people read the book of Judges or they think about the book of Judges, they think about judges like how we would think of them now, like in a courtroom with a gavel and they're ruling over cases. And really, what it is that there's no real leader of Israel. And so it's all of these military leaders trying to rule over the nation. And it's really chaos. It's a lot of people doing whatever it is that they want to do and people trying to be judges who aren't really official judges. Okay, so to understand Ehud, we have to understand the time period. And Israel is living in a cycle that repeats over and over and over. And there's 6 steps to this cycle, which I will tell you now. It's that the people turn away from God, is 1. 2, they fall into oppression. 3, they call out for help. 4, God raises a deliverer. 5, peace comes temporarily. And then 6, the cycle starts all over again. And this should sound really familiar just throughout the Bible, but honestly, it's something that is just the human condition, right? We drift, we suffer consequences for our actions, we cry out for help, and God rescues us over and over again. And in Ehud's time, Israel is oppressed by Moab, led by King Eglon, Eglon. And the scriptures describe this king as a very heavy or fat man. And I know that sounds really random, but it's actually important to the story at one point in time. So Moab dominates over Israel for about 18 years, almost 2 decades, and it's economic oppression, it's political humiliation, and it's national shames. Israel has no dignity at all during this time. And so if you imagine, your whole, if you were born into this, your first 18 years of your life, or maybe if you were 8, 9, 10, the a majority of your young adult life was under foreign control. Something that, here we don't really think about very often, but there's still, it's not just adults that are going through this, it's children. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about putting ourselves in their shoes and how this would be. But then the people cry out to God and God gives them Ehud. So Ehud is the unexpected hero. And Ehud is described as he's a man from the tribe of Benjamin and he's left handed. And I want to tell you why that's important. Now, today, being left handed doesn't really mean much. Now, granted, it is a little bit special because obviously most of us are right handed. So if you're listening and you're left handed, you are special. It doesn't mean nothing today, but it meant much more back then. So in ancient cultures, it mattered a lot because most warriors trained a right hand dominant. And if any of you have ever played sports, and I'm just going to give you kind of an example from my life, one of my really good friends growing up, Sean, him and I played basketball together all the time, and he was left-handed. And him and I would play one-on-one a lot just to work on our craft, work on our handle. We wouldn't take it easy on each other. And I remember, when I first met Sean and I started playing him one-on-one, it was very different playing defense on someone who shot left-handed because naturally when someone went up to shoot, you kind of went towards their right side. And that's kind of what it meant here is that most warriors trained right hand dominant for combat. So weapons were usually carried on the left thigh. So if you think about your weapon being on the left thigh, so with your right hand, you could reach across your body and pull out your sword or your knife, right? So a hood being left-handed meant that he fought differently, he moved differently, and he was unexpected, right? Similar to what I was saying with Sean, when I would go up towards his right side, but he was shooting left, it gave him a cleaner look until I got used to it. And so that's similar how it was, except this was life and death situation and not basketball. So that's why it mattered that he was left-handed. And so some scholars even believe that the phrase could imply that it was a physical limitation in his right hand, that basically he was left-handed because he had some sort of ailment in his right hand. So Ehud might have been seen as someone who was disadvantaged, but really it gave him an advantage. And it's a theme throughout scripture that God uses people that are overlooked or are different or might be looked at as weak or have some sort of deficiency. But God uses Moses, who had a speech problem. He used David, who was the youngest son and small and unexpected. He used Gideon, who was hiding in fear. Paul had a thorn in his side, and obviously we know the whole transformation from Saul to Paul. But God didn't let limitations keep him from using these people. So weakness does not disqualify you from God's purpose. And sometimes it's even the very reason why God chooses these men. All right, so the plan and the strategy and the courage that it took for Ehud to be used by God and to free the Israelites. So Ehud is chosen to deliver tribute to King Eglon. And this is basically a forced tax payment, a reminder that Israel is under Moab's control. So basically, Ehud is chosen to take the money to the king. But Ehud secretly prepares a surprise for the king. So he makes a double-edged sword about a cubit long, and that's roughly 18 inches, and he straps it to his right thigh. So as we said before, if you're right-handed, you would strap your weapon to your left thigh, reach across your body to draw your weapon. So he has it on his right thigh, therefore reaching left-handed across. So because the guards would check his left side, that was the other thing, is that they wouldn't even think to check his right side for his weapon. So they check his left side. They assumed everyone was right-handed, and therefore Ehud hides the weapon in plain sight. So, something that you can learn from this part of the story in today's day and age is that faith does not cancel out preparation, right? We have faith in God, but that doesn't mean that we don't plan steps to our day or take steps to what God is calling us to, right? Like if God is calling you to share your faith with people or lead in some form or fashion, it doesn't mean that you just jump in and just wing it, right? You still make a plan. You still try to be wise about how you go about the things that God is calling you to. Now, there obviously are times where you're going to be called to something in the moment and you got to just have faith in God and do the best you can. But it doesn't negate preparation. Your faith doesn't negate preparation. Sometimes God works through wisdom and foresight, not just on the spot miracles or happenstance. So Ehud delivers the tribute and then he leaves with his group, but then he turns back alone, right? So he brings the money to the king, he leaves, but then he turns back. And this is the moment where his courage shows because he's about to risk his own life. So he turns back after delivering the money, leaving, then he turns back and he says to the king, I have a secret message for you. And so the king dismisses everyone from the room. And now Ehud is alone with the most powerful man in the region. He has no backup. He has no witnesses. It's just him and this enemy king. So Ehud approaches the king while the king is sitting in a private upper chamber. And then it says this, I have a message from God for you. And that statement gets the king to stand up in that moment, right? It's kind of like a shocking statement. So he stands up. And in that moment, Ehud draws the sword with his left hand and he plunges it into the king's abdomen. So what we talked about earlier about the king being heavy or whatever, it comes into play because he does have an advantage over the king. But it also says that when he plunges it into the king's abdomen, it describes the blade as disappearing completely, even the handle. It's graphic, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it raises a question of why would God use such violence? And we have to remember that God doesn't do anything random or without reason. It's not just a random aggression. This is war deliverance, during national oppression, right? It's not like, just some a friendly joking or put downs of a nation. No, they are a tyrant holding God's people under their thumb, and God is rescuing them. And so the Bible records events honestly, right? And I think it's why sometimes people have that phrase of, the God of the Old Testament is vicious and unmerciful and things like that, because there is a lot of war times in the Old Testament where people are enslaved and under tyranny and taken advantage of, and their dignity is stripped from them. I mean, we see that today, right? When you have a tyrant, people want justice. You want people to come in and help the people that are oppressed. And that is what God is doing. And the Bible doesn't pull punches. It shows what actually happened and it shows events, even the messy ones. And, God often works within broken human systems to accomplish redemption, right? When his people decide to wander from him, there's consequences for that. And lots of times that's why they are under oppression. But God always comes to rescue his people. After the assassination, Hood locks the doors and he escapes while the servants assume the king is using the restroom. That's what it says in the scriptures. And it's almost like a dark humor, right? Like if you think about, an action movie where the protagonist, kills the antagonist and slips out and he's like, oh yeah, he's using the restroom. And so it says they waited there for the king. And by the time they realize what has happened, the hood is long gone. And so they realize that the king has died. So here's what's powerful about this story. It's really the last little bit. Now, obviously, this is kind of the cinematic part, the crazy part, but here's what's powerful about the rest of the story. It's that Ehud doesn't just kill the king and just disappear into the night, never to be seen again by the people or anything like that. What he does is he steps into leadership of the Israelites. Like I said at the very beginning, this is a time of chaos. The book of Judges, there's no real leader of Israel. There's all these warlords that are trying to be judges. There's not real leadership going on. And so Ehud steps into leadership. So he goes back to the people. He blows a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim and he rallies Israel. And this moment matters because courage oftentimes is contagious. And that's what we see here. One act of boldness can awaken courage in the rest of the people. And so Israel follows him into battle. And it says that they battle and defeat Moab. And the land has peace for 80 years after this. It's the longest period of peace in the book of Judges. And it all started with one man who was overlooked, right? Who was looked at as deficient or less than. So, what does this mean for us? We're obviously not being called to assassinate a king or to rally troops for battle, but the principles of this are deeply relevant to us. So number one is that God uses what makes you different oftentimes, right? Ehud's left-handedness was the key to the mission, the thing that makes you feel inadequate or different or overlooked. Oftentimes is exactly what God needs to use you. It may actually be an advantage in God's hands, right? Using something that is looked at as a weakness can be used as an advantage in God's hands. Your story is not an obstacle. Lots of times we look at our story or our bodies or our intelligence or whatever it may be as an obstacle, but God uses it as a tool. I was just talking about I've worked with teens a lot in my adult life, leading teen ministries. And, I was talking about one of my guys that became a very good friend of mine, and how, when I first met him, he was not very confident and had a hard time speaking. He got real nervous speaking in front of people, and it caused not necessarily a stutter, but just where he would like repeat things and kind of ramble. And as I saw him grow over the 4 years I was with him, something that was so cool is that, early on, he would not really speak up, even if he had something to say. But I think because of his character, he had such great character that he led by example, so that when he did speak up, even though it was an obstacle for him, people listened because of who he was and how he lived his life. And so God really used his voice in a powerful way, even though that was one of his weaknesses. Because he was so strong in his character, people knew when this guy speaks up, I'm going to listen. And so that was just an example, and it could be something else for you, but just think about these things that, Satan tries to tell you, you can't do this or that because of this weakness that you have or this deficiency that you have. But God wants to use those things. His power is made great in our weakness. Number two is that oppression doesn't last forever. Israel suffered 18 years during this period of oppression, and that is a long time. Sometimes we think this situation will never change. This situation will never end, but God can shift things suddenly and in very unexpected ways through unexpected people. One moment can alter history, right? If you go and dig into, World War II and all the really amazing stories of people that affected the war and saved lives, and obviously we know it was a devastating war and so sad, but there's so many amazing stories about so many amazing people. And there probably would have been way more deaths without the courage of so many individuals, not just in World War II, but that's just one of the big examples that we can look to in our history, and see that acts of courage can alter the course of history. All right, so the first two, God uses what makes you different, and oppression doesn't last forever. The third thing that we can take from this for today is that faith requires action. Ehud didn't just pray for deliverance, he participated in the deliverance, right? There's a partnership between God's power and our obedience, right? God is what makes it happen, but he's got to use a vessel. And so, or he doesn't have to use a vessel, but he chooses to use a vessel. So we have to obey in order to be a part of the deliverance. So miracles often begin with someone taking a step forward, right? So that's 3. Faith requires action. Number 4 is that courage is usually private first, right? Before Ehud led a nation, he stood alone in a room with the king. Most public victories start with private obedience, right? So many of the victories we've had in our lives started with a prayer in our room in bed at night. It started with a conversation one-on-one with someone. It started with one step by ourselves with God moving towards a bigger goal, right? So courage is usually private first. And like I said, there's always going to be times where situations arise and you might just have to have courage on the spot. But when there's something big, like we talked about, that you're planning, courage takes place private first. Number 5 is that God can work through imperfect situations, right? The book of Judges is so messy. People are flawed, leadership is imperfect, and yet God still moves, right? It should encourage us because our lives are messy. Everyone's lives are messy, whether you're rich, poor, beautiful, not so great looking, whatever your case is, life is messy, but God can work through imperfect situations. So I want to give y'all, I know this is like a little bit lessony, but I wanted to give you guys some reflection questions. Like if y'all are listening to this and I don't know if this is a good idea, bad idea, but take it as you will if you'd like to reflect on these things. And if not, that's cool too. But, I wanted to ask, where do you feel overlooked right now? Think about where you feel overlooked and how that's affecting your mood, how that's affecting your confidence, things like that. How are you feeling overlooked? Then think, what difference in you might God want to use? So whatever it is that maybe you're feeling overlooked by, what difference in you might be something that God wants to use? Third question is there a situation where courage is required in your life? And again, think about what we just talked about. It starts in private moments, right? So if there's something that requires courage, pray about it, talk to God about it. Find someone that's been through that situation before in your life, if possible. Have some conversations about it. But is there a situation in your life right now where, maybe you've been avoiding it? Maybe you're scared to have that conversation. Maybe you're scared to talk to that coworker about something that's bothering you, or, talk to your boss about that raise or promotion, whatever it may be. Pray about those things. And are you willing, or are you waiting for God to act? And while he's waiting for you, are you waiting for God to act while he's waiting for you to? So basically what that means is, oftentimes we sit still, right? And we're like, all right, God, I'm waiting on you. And he's like, no, I'm waiting on you. And the example I always use, the most common command in all of the scriptures is do not be afraid, right? And in Exodus, when the Israelites are once again escaping tyranny and escaping slavery, they're running from Pharaoh and they're running towards the Red Sea. And, Pharaoh lets them go. Then he changes his mind and he's chasing after them, right? And the Israelites are freaking out. And Moses basically says, do not be afraid, like be still, and the Lord will defeat your enemy on this day. I'm kind of butchering it, but basically he's saying like be still, like do not be afraid, like be still. And then God comes and he says to Moses, why are you calling out to me? He says, tell them to move on, like go, like no, don't wait for me, go. And then after that is when he splits the Red Sea and he protects them. But they had to get to the Red Sea in order for God to part it and use the Red Sea to deliver them, right? So lots of times we're sitting there and waiting, and God's like, no, I need you to move right over there. I need you to get right there. Then we can get through this. So lots of times we're waiting for God to move, and he's like, no, I need you to move so that I can move. So sometimes breakthrough starts with one uncomfortable step during a scary moment like the Israelites in Exodus. So I want to give you an encouragement too. So the story of Ehud reminds us that God doesn't just use the obvious heroes, right? He uses ordinary people with willingness and a heart that says yes to him. You don't have to be the strongest or the most qualified or even the most confident. You just have to be available. And when God empowers someone, even empires fall, as we see in this story. It says that they defeated over 10,000 men, I believe. Empires fall when you say yes to God and He empowers you. So I hope that this episode, I know it was a little funky and a little interesting, a little different, but I hope that it encouraged you. Maybe you're hearing this and someone else in your life is sticking out that maybe they need to hear this story. And so share it with someone who's feeling overlooked or stuck, because your story isn't finished. And, if you feel like you're stuck, if you feel like you're being overlooked, God has unexpected deliverance for you. And so I really hope that this story of Ehud in the book of Judges really inspires you. Go ahead and read it. I'll remind you again, it's in Judges 3, and I believe it's verses 8 through 30, or 12 through 30. So go ahead and read it. It's not very long. It's a very interesting story, but there's so many golden nuggets throughout this story if you really read in between the lines and see what God is doing. So as always, I love you guys. We will be back next week. I'm hoping to have Gio on for the next episode. But remember to like, comment, share, subscribe to the YouTube. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave a rating and a review. That would help us out a lot. But we love you guys. And as Jordan always says, I'm out.